Welcome to the third part on our focus on high performance board tools. In this session, we're going to focus on the board meeting itself. Now, what's really interesting around the three that form part of the series is that the board meeting itself is only one category of tools. And so what's really important to remember that the time spent in a board meeting is really critical and is really a magic opportunity. There's a whole lot of things that need to support it. Yet at the end of the day, the board meeting itself is not the beginning and end of a high performance board. There are so many other factors to take into account, and when we put too much emphasis on the board meeting, we forget that for a director, being a director is 24/7. It's not a 4 or 5 hour meeting once a month or once every second month. So on that note, if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You're probably tired of me saying this, but it's true. If we don't have the right toolkit, if we only have a limited set of tools, the problems that we try and solve, we see them through the lens of those tools, and we don't appreciate that everything within a high-performance board process, within governance, has particular tools that it requires. So in this session, we're going to talk about the board meetings. And in the board meetings, one of the most important tools, I'm going to say each tool is one of the most important tools, so apologies in advance, but one of the most important tools is the agenda. And so this is defined and agreed between the chairman and the managing director as part of the planning cycle. The pre-board meeting is agreeing the agenda. I've included a little bit of a sample from one of our templates of what are some of the things that should be on there, and the agenda really plots out the theme and scope of the meeting, and also where we're going to put time. So in other words, it's an opportunity to allocate time and to decide what is important. If there's a particular strategy that's really important, you perhaps are going to give it more than 30 minutes, but if there's a particular management report that's being presented, perhaps that requires more time. Typically, a board meeting is 4 to 5 hours in a private company and on a more frequent basis, because the pace of growth and evolution in a smaller private company compared to a large or listed company is a massive difference. You know, things happen in much more shorter learning cycles in a smaller company. So we are often asked, you know, surely you can have a quarterly board meeting. People are busy and they haven't got time. Well, in environments where you have a quarterly board meeting, like for example a listed company, you actually have committees, sometimes 3 or 4 committees, board committees that meet on regular cycles. And so if you had to take in all the activity that's happening across the year in terms of governance and boards, it's still a monthly board process. So we do not advocate that private companies have a quarterly board. You know, by the time you had a quarterly board, the whole world has moved on in a private company space, and the opportunity is lost to build that momentum. It just, there's too much event happening in a short space of time, which makes private company directorship so exciting as well. So that's a little bit of a side note around board frequency. So the agenda sets the scope and it sets the timing, what's important and what happens when. And in the board meeting itself, the chairman is responsible for chairing the meeting and of course for setting the tone and making sure that everything follows due process and that time allocations are met. And if there are specific things need to go onto the agenda, that's noted, and if time allocations must be adjusted, that's contracted and agreed with everybody. So it's really about making sure that the board meeting happens according to plan. Once we were asked by a director, why are we so pedantic in our thinking around board meetings have a fixed start and a fixed end time? So in other words, if you're planning to start at 8 in the morning, you start at 8 and you finish 4 hours later, 12. You don't finish at whenever you finish the discussion, you finish at a set time. What that brings about to the board is a focus on being specific and planning and being to the point. So yes, it may be that some emergency issue, some big issue requires extra time. And from time to time, that may impact the board meeting length. Yet what would that mean for a company culture if the end time of a board meeting was never fixed? It was whenever we finished discussing. There was no sense of urgency, no sense of commitment to meeting a time frame. And I would put money on it that if you were committed to an end time and you met that end time, you would still get everything done. You just wouldn't fill the blank spaces with waffle. Or you just, you know, get prioritize what's really important for the meeting. Or if there was a person, that was waffling, that you would ask the chairman to please create some order so that we can get through the agenda, not because we're racing through the agenda, but because we want to create value. And we can't create value if we're unfocused and all over the place. So an interesting thought and challenge to think about. It's about creating the discipline of setting an agenda and then meeting the timeframes around it. And of course, the discipline, focus, and keeping the energy up is really important. In later sessions, we'll explain to you why we suggest you talk about strategy and blue sky thinking at the beginning of the meeting. But it's really about keeping energy of the group up throughout the process. And the biggest challenge of the board meeting itself is that the directors drop into operational detail too easily. So something to think about and pay attention to in the agenda. Now, the next part of the board meeting structure is the board reports themselves. So these are the reports that are circulated to the board in certain timeframes prior to the board meeting. The agenda is an important part of that, as are matters arising, minutes from the last meeting, etc. Yet in that, you'll find that there are particular board reports that are included, particular reports from management, decision papers, information papers, particularly your financials, etc., that are included as an important part of keeping the board informed around what's going on and eliciting the board's input on decision making. So the papers themselves, just to talk about the timing issues, is that this is an area around timing and flow and preparation that as an independent director you are no doubt going to literally bash your head over. Remember that a company that is new to governance and new to boards, and indeed ones that are long experienced in the process, might have some challenges around the quality of their reporting. So that might be the experience and attention of the managing director, their time availability, the quality of their reporting systems, the ability to drive information through on time, and perhaps even a lack of commitment that, honoring the timeline to directors is important. So we would say that the board meeting is what we call tea, or timeout. That's where we meet and we then use the papers. And it is recommended that directors have at least 5 working days from which to prepare from the papers. That means that this is the minimum amount of time that is deemed to be appropriate for a director to fulfill their fiduciary duty. So there we can see the board meeting, and prior to that the papers are circulated T-5 working days prior to the board meeting. Yet there is a process of collating board papers. So in other words, someone's got to sit and put those packs together and make sure they're indexed and the agenda has the page numbers collated and cross-referenced, and that the pack is prepared in sequence, the documents are all appearing in sequence of the agenda, and that might take a couple of days. So we would say that in our approach that a managing director should submit all board papers 10 days prior to the board, 10 working days. So that can be as close to the circulation period as 7 days, depending on your support team, to collect that information. And so say 7 to 10 days, and then those are collated and formalized, finalized, and then circulated 5 days prior to the board. I cannot tell you the challenge that this timing process brings for companies new to boards, and indeed companies that are in the process and still learning. It is quite a big undertaking, and you will at some point experience the frustration of being a director and receiving your papers late, feeling rushed, feeling like you haven't really had an opportunity to get stuck into those papers. And perhaps you've even set aside a day, you've allocated a time in your diary in those 5 days leading up to the board, where you're now going to sit down and you're really going to interpret what has been put in front of you. Then can you imagine that the papers are then late? We sometimes have had experiences, and we still do, where literally the directors are sitting in the board meeting and they're still being mailed to the board. How does the board prepare? How is that those 4 hours together worthwhile? Is it just a random discussion? Is it, so it's that kind of thinking to really challenge the business to lift its game around the flow of information and making sure those board reports come with a quality as well as a timing. Also bear in mind that it takes time for a company to establish those routines. So I mentioned before, have some kindness for the difficulties that are there, yet at the end of the day, you are the director. You are the one who has to act in the best interests of the company and has to make the best decisions. And if you haven't been able to prepare the papers, you're now being asked to make a decision on something that you haven't had time to prepare for. So there's a number of different ways that, as a board, as the chairman, that you can manage that. One is to get quite tough with the managing director. Once you've established the reasons, and the reasons might just be it's not the thing they like doing, so they leave it to the last minute. So once you've established that, is to put in place some specific requirements around that, perhaps build that into their KPIs. Maybe link their performance bonus. If you're late with your papers beyond a certain percentage, then your performance bonus at the end of the year is gone or significantly reduced. Then you're going to get more papers on time. So it's about thinking around how you can use some of those processes. Worst case scenario, your chairman on behalf of the board might have to consider performance or remedial action against the managing director, who's the custodian of the process and is responsible to make sure the entire team gets it done. And that might be warning letters and other disciplinary action, worst case scenario. And as a director, if you are time and time again given board papers late and you feel that you haven't been able to make a good decision related to what's been put in front of you, maybe it's a decision paper, if not acting is better than acting against a bad decision, you might have to say to the managing director, I'm very sorry, I'm not willing to make a decision or support this decision. I'll not acknowledge my dissent because I've not been able to adequately prepare. So there's a number of different ways that you can work around the reality of this process, and you will experience it at least once. Then we have what we call information discussion and decision papers. Now these are within your board papers. The board papers are as a unit. These are particular types of papers. So they literally are a proposition or a piece of information and supporting documents that gives the board something in particular. And using this idea of information through to discussion, through to decision, is a wonderful way of maturing the decision-making process of the organization. So an immature decision-making process, which is often seen in private companies, is that the executive directors might bump into each other down the passage and make a decision there and then. No supporting data, no awareness even of the personal risk exposure they're putting themselves into making decisions like that. And so it matures the decision-making. It starts to take a process of slowing the decision-making process down, but making better decisions that create more value. The challenge of using this process or using the structure is that it can result in rebellion. Your managing director might think, oh, I've got to go through so many hoops to try and get a decision made. I'm just going to do it by myself and take the consequences, because what are they going to do after all? Fire me? I'm the major shareholder? Well, maybe if you breach the delegation of authority and it's a fireable offense, then maybe you're gone. So rebellion might not be a great idea, or can create standstill. Decisions just don't get made. So it's how you, as an independent director, honor this maturing process of really starting to improve the quality of decisions made, yet also not be so stickler around the process that it stops decisions altogether. So you've got to find that place in between. So there are three types of paper per se. One is an information paper. That is an FYI to the board. It's usually done related to perhaps something that's happened in the market, an interesting article that's relevant that the board must read. And it's a way for the managing director to say, look, this is something that I think is quite important for you to read. It gives you context. It's for your information. There's no decision or discussion required. It's just for reading and for reference, particularly related to market changes or things that are happening with competitors and things like that. The next step is, once you've given the board a bit of information on an area, perhaps it's a new piece of technology that's relevant in your market, the next type of paper is a discussion paper. And that has a little bit more robustness to it. It says, here's more information, and here are the 3 important questions we should debate and discuss as a board. And here's why we should discuss them. Okay, so the information paper leads to the discussion paper, and the discussion paper then leads to the next paper, the last paper, a decision paper. Decision paper says, based on the discussion paper, you gave me a couple of areas to focus on and think about, but Mr. Board, or IT Board. As Managing Director, I've gone away and I've taken all your questions and comments and considerations and concerns, and here is an updated set of data, and I propose that we do the following ABC. This is why I propose, and here's the supporting data to support my proposal. Do you agree, yes or no? And that's the decision paper. So not every decision reaches the board through this process. That would take too long. But it's starting to think around, at least some decision papers should have had some backstory. They don't just arrive at a decision paper out the blue, unless the board has mandated you to go ahead and propose a decision without having any kind of discussion. But usually things like coming up with a policy, there'll be some kind of discussion at a board level to give you some guiding principles as an MD, and then the MD would then take that and refashion that and present it as a final paper to be approved. And then if the board is satisfied with the proposal and the logic behind it, and it's for the best interest of the company, they pass a resolution to accept the recommendation, or perhaps they accept it with some tweaks. So it can be, we accept the decision paper, but with these adjustments. Okay, so that is a key part of the decision-making process, and it's really useful to understand this kind of methodology of going step by step. Now, usually these 3 papers are a covering letter or covering a page. It has a particular structure to it that is then overlaid a particular set of data or supporting data or information or the reports that go with it. Then there are policies, the dusty file. I mentioned that I would talk a little bit around policies in an earlier session, and the opportunity with policies is that really they are probably the most important instrument of the board, the most important tool. Because what they do is they allow the board to create clear standards for decision making and to speed up growth. So in other words, a management meeting might sit and discuss whether or not to buy a new car for the salesperson. And that might be a big debate around whether or not we should buy this particular car and what all the options are, lease versus outright purchase, etc. A board, when presented with that kind of decision, will say, we'll help you make a decision. However, what's more important is that we agree a policy on purchasing cars for salespeople. And if we apply our minds, instead of trying to solve the micro problem, but thinking, what is the standard that is in the best interest of the company, and let's agree that and sign that off. Surely that's a better way of the board maximizing its time. So that next time there's a question around a car for a salesperson, the board doesn't have to make that decision because it's already embedded its decision in a policy. Management doesn't have to wait. They just have to make sure they honor the policy. So policies are so critical for the board. The board should be producing policies and getting those implemented, especially in an environment which is new to a board. So I often say, if you've got board papers coming in for a company and you haven't seen any policy submitted for decision for 3 board meetings, the board is not doing something they should be doing. Like something else should be happening to create and instill policy within the organization. So for you as an independent director, start thinking, well, I haven't seen a policy come around. So how as a board are we augmenting and translating our authority into processes that we can hand over to management to make it easier for management to do their job and to remove the workload off the board, that we aren't involved in all these micro operational processes. So the opportunity really are clear standards of decision making, speeding up growth, because now the management can get on with it. They don't have to keep on asking or waiting for 2 months or trying to get a round-robin decision. It just speeds things up. And of course, the challenge is the dusty old policy file. We all celebrate the moment we sign off that policy, it goes into the file, and it's like the Bermuda Triangle, never to be seen again. So that really, with policies in general, particularly around operational policies, is really tough. And I'm a strong believer that if you're creative and you see policies for what they really are tools of leverage, then there are ways of bringing policies to life. That is not about the dusty file, but about integrating policy into the way that the organization functions. Line of sight from the board and its policy through to measurement and performance. And of course, the other trick and challenge is that sometimes people love making policies more complicated than they are or they need to be. So policies can be overly detailed, overly prescriptive, and it's really important that a company and a board asks itself, what is the type of organization we're trying to create? Are we a rules-based organization or a principle-based organization? So a rules-based organization will have a detailed policy on the use of company emails. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. Detail, 4 pages on one policy. That's a micro policy. A principle governed policy system or policy organization is one that says we expect you to care for company assets as if they were your own. So this is just an example, but it's a way of saying in one statement, do unto others, treat our assets as you would your own assets. So if you're not doing that, you're not in harmony with the policy. We're expecting as a group of adults you to adhere to a principle, and the principle then guides our behavior. Now, on lower levels of operational staff where you need to be absolutely explicit, okay, maybe the detailed policy is relevant there. Can it be brought to life? Do people understand the policies that govern them? Always in the dusty file, and then when someone does something wrong, the file comes out and point 13.2.3, you're in breach. What do we need to do to make sure policies are accessible to people? We really encourage directors to think about policy as principles, and to think about, do we need all that micro principle, or can we have a couple of guiding principles that are simple, easy to access, and clear to guide behavior, and are of course aligned with company values. And of course with that is making sure policies haven't got a compliance view. They're there to make sure people are punished for wrongdoing, as opposed to providing boundaries to guide growth. And so this is a very strong alignment to company culture too, that if you have a compliance view culture, you'll have compliance view policies. Then we have another tool called the Expedition Update. I will share with you more of this as we go along. It is quite an interesting and complex tool that takes quite a lot of learning to unpack, but I wanted to just bring it into your awareness early on in the game so that we can just keep it in the back of our minds. The Expedition Update is a dashboard of strategic measures, and they are future performance measures. They measure the extent to which future performance is likely. They are not your standard financial performances that look backwards. So you will not find things like return on investment and assets and net profit percentage and things like that in an Expedition Update. Those should be in your financial pack and reported on anyway. These are measures that are specifically aligned to your strategic dashboard, your outcomes and intent, your tactics, and they allow you, the board, and you as a director to understand the extent to which it is likely we will achieve our strategic outcomes. They require quite a lot of clever thinking. They should be really simple. Simpler is better, and they allow us to really think about interesting metrics that are directly and specifically aligned to our tactics and our strategy. The challenge with the Expedition Update is that very often the systems and data required to drive those kinds of interesting metrics aren't in place. So you might find that sometimes you have metrics that are a work in progress. In other words, they're simple to start with or have specific ways they're measured, yet over time, as those systems come online to drive data, they can get more interesting. And I always have this view that it is better to have one most important and critical measure on an Expedition Update than nothing. the one most important metric that's like the oxygen levels on your gas tank when you go up Everest. The most important metric you have is make sure that you have that in place. Just one. You start there. And as you go along and as you evolve it, you can add other metrics to that. But I will share more with you as we go. Meeting minutes. Wow, the meeting minutes are often seen as, oh dear, here's the minutes. Some poor creatures had to capture these minutes and record them, and they're not really important because we were in the meeting, we knew what we talked about. Why do we need these minutes? So meeting minutes are a record of the decisions and actions that were agreed coming out of the minutes, who was present, and the time and place of the meeting. We do not support the idea of verbatim minutes, where every single word of the meeting is recorded and who says what is like a script of a play. We prefer the idea of action and resolution-driven minutes, where only what's recorded is perhaps some key outcomes of a discussion, summarized and directed by the chairman, and that the action items that are required for the period to come are highlighted, and any resolutions passed are specifically noted. So, having meeting minutes is an absolutely critical tool for your protection as a director. They are a record of the decisions that were made, when they were made, how they were made. And if you think about some of the criteria of making good decisions and following the business judgment rule, you've got to be sure that the decisions you followed have been duly noted in that report or in the minutes, so that it can be used as a protection tool. If you have, in particular, want to note your dissent against a particular vote or decision, you can indeed do that, and that's minuted, which means that you are given and afforded some protection. Being able to get those action drivers and information out of the minutes quickly is really important, because it means the management team can kick into high gear after the meeting and start getting on with implementing those actions. Huge challenges around this process. One, that people just think minutes are a kind of an admin-y process. Actually, they're really critical. They can take too long to produce. So if minutes come out 3 weeks after the board meeting, how is the managing director supposed to have implemented them before the next meeting? All board directors are required to review the minutes and provide input on their accuracy. So if you aren't getting feedback in time and directors are taking forever to review, how do you get those minutes out? Quality of minutes is primarily directly related to the quality of the chairman. A chairman that is in control, in charge, and follows the right process and makes sure that actions are clearly highlighted for a board secretary to note, and resolutions that are clearly noted and discussions that are summarized well, will get quality minutes. Particularly if your board secretary is not even sitting in the board, is a recorded support. So we use that approach. We record board meetings. Those recordings go to a board secretary who then record. Now, if you are sitting listening to a recording, you only have your ears to go by. You can't see faces. And unless the chairman is doing a good job of following good protocol, of chairing, of summarizing, of clearly outlining action items and noting specific things, you're going to have a problem with quality minutes. So a number of board tools under board meetings, and the quality of the board meeting and the way that it's framed and the outcomes of the meeting are a huge direct result of the quality of the chairman. And so the chairman following due process and lifting his or her game is a really important part of board meetings being highly productive, highly focused, and really amazing deliverables for the business for the period to come. I trust that you enjoyed that series on high performance board tools, and you'll no doubt get an opportunity to use all of them in the near future.